last paper of this session to be presented by Mr. Andrei-Valentin. Is he available? Andrew?
Yes, sir. I'm right here.
Please.
Okay. Hi. Okay. So I'm guessing I'm visible. So good morning again to everyone. A lot of familiar faces. So hi again to Bhupesh and to Grant. I see Rakesh sir is here. I'm not sure. Feel free to unmute yourself and say hi, Rakesh sir. Long time no see. And special shout out to George Lawa. He's here with me on the East Coast in the United States. It's about 3 a.m. here. So given that it's also the last presentation, I'll try to keep it quite. Oh, and Prasanth Kumarji is also here. Awesome. Is my presentation visible? Hello?
Yes, it is.
It is? Okay. So I'll begin with the talk now. So the title, as per the flyer, is Soteriological Dialectics in Dhyamaka and Hegel. So a few framework objectives that I've had in mind. The metaphysical investigation and methodical resolve of philosophical problems are the same, or at least loosely enough resemblant that it's worth investigating philosophically in some detail. I would argue that such comparative work offers academic value, though there are no real philosophical problems. I've stayed far away from academic philosophy for a while, and I sincerely don't think there are any philosophical problems whatsoever. But as per the encouragement of Remia Shimi and Shrikala ma'am, I have decided to needlessly present something. The questions pertaining to the history of philosophy and philosophy of history, as we should all know by now, Hegel is the philosopher of history par excellence, and the human nature, as well as the classical relationships between mind, language, and reality. These kind of thematic notions are paramount in significance, not only to understanding Hegel to some extent, but also I would argue that they are necessary features of any Madhyamaka debate as well. And this presentation is primarily directed towards the right Hegelians. After Hegel passed away, the legacy split in half. The right Hegelians kind of understanding his hermeneutics as having a religious scope, some sort of soteriological scope, some sort of theological or theosophical nuance, whereas the left Hegelians leaned more towards the political aspects of the dialectics and the Napoleonic nuances that came with it. So a few objectives here: observational similarities, resemblances. There's temporal contingencies of impermanence, the anitya features. Both Hegel and the Madhyamikas accept this type of feature of time for them to be able to build up their philosophical towering projects from there. Now, systematization of investigating truth via some type of epistemic ascent containing embedded revisionary practices. The Hegelian triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is a continuously and ongoing kind of intellectual project, if you will, of constantly revising and sharpening the adequacy standards of representations of truth and the Madhyamika doctrines of the two truths that are in conjunction with the 10 bhumis, right? There's a very strict sequential progression also in the Madhyamika system as per how a practitioner actually advances on the path. It is primarily found in the Dasha Bhumika Sutra. This sutra is also paramount for making sense, and to a greater extent, of the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka Avatar, and any other commentary, all the way to Mipam's commentaries. The objective of showing resemblance or equivalency, that is. Now, here's what I'm trying to achieve with this. There's sufficient explanatory consistency to show the theoretical, practical, and methodical resemblance between the traditions, such that this comparative study has some academic value. Now, the thesis argument, as per thesis and quotation marks for various semantic reasons, but it is the argument that I try to propose in this presentation, but also trying to be wary at the same time of the aforementioned triad of the thesis and the antithesis. So the Buddhist conception of the excellent, irreversible, meditative equipoise of enlightenment, the Tibetan would be Yangdar Dzogpa Sangye Kilama Mepa, right, as explained in the Vajrachedika Prajna Paramita Sutra, which is a not as well known. The Prajna Paramita literature is extraordinarily vast, right? And one of the subcategories of the pieces also includes the Vajrachedika Sutra, which would be kind of like the diamond cutting sutra as well. So what I'm trying to argue here is that it is synonymous or in some way resemblant, semantically, practically, theoretically, however else, with Hegel's notion of the spirit, the Geist. And secondly, I shall argue that the employment of the dialectic logic in both Hegel's work again, emphasis on the right Hegelians, and the Madhyamika philosophy has the same heuristic scope and soteriological objective. The Madhyamikas themselves are also very polemic. They employ different kind of tactics of reasoning. The Prasangikas are very infamously known for their reductio ad absurdums and so forth. So what I'm trying to push forward here is that methodically, the way Hegel conceives that an argument pushes the world forward towards a clear understanding of truth, Madhyamikas similarly kind of offer a similar perspective. Now, given the constraints here, and that I would prefer to have a more extensive discussion than for you guys to just read a few boring PowerPoint slides, I'll try to go through this quite swiftly. So the Geist in Hegel's work has transformed from a cognitive process of self-disillusion in the phenomenology of spirit to a discursive method of interacting with reason to see beyond appearances and resolve contradictions, which is eventually extended further in the science of logic. By identifying the causal source of appearances and their relationship to conceptual formations, I argue that Madhyamikas and Hegel use such cognitive acts to show the limits and instrumental value of conceivability and how such reflections lead to a soteriological goal. And a few remarks on Graham Priest, given his prevalence in precipitation and the limits of thought. He has argued that Hegel is a dialetheist, and although I'm not necessarily questioning that position here, Graham's contributions are definitely noteworthy. He would add here that we went by certain processes through ever more complex categories until we arrive at the richest and most adequate category for conceptualizing reality, the absolute idea, which similarly in the Madhyamika tradition, I would say the absolute idea here would be the context of Buddhahood, right? All kind of possible contexts and denotations, even Chandrakirti, however bitter he might have been at times, he argued that the foundational scope of all possible debates in Madhyamika tradition are to liberate all sentient beings. And I kind of try to add a little footnote here, saying that the negation of negation, which is also kind of logical procedure that Hegel tries to engage with, is kind of loosely similar to the links of becoming in the Praticca Samuppada, specifically the bhava link. So for according to Hegel, something which is changing from being F to not being F is in transition both F and not F. Hence, the third category here is a category of becoming. Now, I'll specifically focus on these two texts and leave the philosophy of right outside of the scope of this presentation. Here's something interesting, right? So the thesis and antithesis and their proofs, therefore, represent nothing but the opposite assertions that the limit is, and the limit equally is only sublated one, that the limit has a beyond, which is, however, stands in a relation, and beyond which it must pass, but that in doing so arises another such limit, which is no limit, right? Going back to everything that in the Madhyamaka kind of metaphysical system rejects intrinsic existence, accepts interdependent origination, and then they kind of accept how causes and conditionings kind of pervade through all 3 times and 10 directions. So we see some similarity here in emphasizing the relational properties that give rise to extrinsically appearing autonomous objects, when in fact they're all kind of causal byproducts of a lot of processes in ourselves as sentient beings and subjects also as well. Now, for the phenomenology of spirit, there's a few things that I will only hint. Again, this is more about kind of contextualizing Hegel in the Madhyamaka system, but this project can be much more vast than that. So perception, likewise, this is Hegel directly, well, through English translation, but is dialectically flawed by its incapacity to integrate these separate characteristics it picks out with the unified individuality of the object which it seeks out to attribute to them. And then there's kind of extensive discussions Hegel undergoes about what the mistaken perception is and how overcoming this type of mistaken perception and its respective cogitative modalities help us kind of see that Geist clearly, right? So this is a clear, at least to me, I'm trying to convince you all that this is kind of a similarity to the Arya perception notion in the Madhyamika, right? That conventional truth, the Samvritti Satya is by default mistaken. It is somehow bound by the four conceptual extremes of the Chatushkoti, and the only way to actually go and see beyond what is in the extremes of the 4 corners is to have the right kind of perception, right? And a few other passages that are reminiscent of Dharmakirti and Chandrakirti, where he says that the I, Hegel, that is, does not have the significance of a manifold imagining or thinking, nor does the thing signify something that has a host of qualities, right? So this kind of hints at Dharmakirti's commentaries of the selflessness of persons, the qualitylessness of mind. Kind of skipping a little through this passage, let's just look at what Hegel here is emphasizing is just which is the force that seem to make an independent appearance, right? So this is a very classical Madhyamika 101 move where all objects are some sort of appearance. You don't reject the ontology of objects, but you reject the inherent existence of those respective objects, right? So very typical Madhyamika move, and as we have seen, kind of with this heuristic and scaffolding kind of procedures of the thesis and antithesis and the synthesis in the Hegelian system. There's this notion of the dualisms are there, the dialectics are there, the non-dualisms are there, which are also very typical features of how eventually the Mahayana and the Vajrayana system systematizes the respective conceptual and perceptual schemas as well. And a quick note on the mind. Obviously, the mind is huge to a German idealist, and not to mention to a Buddhist practitioner, right? That both worlds, however, are engrasped by spirit, which, after this loss of itself, withdraws into itself, engrasped by the notion, are confounded and revolutionized by the insight of the individual, and that diffusion, that insight, known as the enlightenment, and the realm which was divided and expanded into this world and beyond, returns into self-consciousness, which now, in the form of morality, grasps itself as the essentiality and essence, as the actual self. That is no longer places the world and its ground outside itself, but lets everything fade into itself. And as a conscience and the spirit, it's certain of itself, right? There's this notion of the conviction. Even the Buddha himself was extraordinarily confident after he has achieved his final samadhi under the Bodhi tree, right? That this notion of going beyond this, the paragata aspect, the parasamgata aspects of the Prajnaparamita literature. And something that perhaps some of you might be interested in is that even later on in the Phenomenology of Spirit, there's a very methodically loose, similar, I would argue, investigation of what this prapanch is, right? A lot of classical and even late classical Sanskrit texts describe nirvana as cessation, right? There's some prapanch. There is the cessation of the root causes of rebirth, such as desires and aversions and attachments, right? So um, through these kind of interpretations, Hegel here also similarly, I would argue, says that at issue, these are shapes of consciousness, each of which dissolves itself and being realized has its own negation for result, and thereby has gone to an even higher shape. As far as I'm concerned, if you take this passage, you can literally paste it into any kind of Indian text, right? If you put this passage next to Shankaracharya, it literally sounds like a moksha experience of a Jivan Mukta. Or if you take this passage and you put it into any sort of kind of Mahayana or Vajrayana scripture, you'll find it totally compatible in that sense. Now, last but not least, and this is a little, perhaps I moved quite swiftly because I really hope to at least have some conversations with you. This is more towards the elitist aspects of the academia, where Chandrakirti is overly celebrated, right? I mean, I know Rakesh is here in the panel. I'm not entirely sure if he's in the conversation, but I know for sure that he thinks that Wittgenstein is overly celebrated in the Western tradition. Well, needlessly, I think Chandrakirti is even more celebrated in the Indian philosophical tradition than even Wittgenstein himself is celebrated in Western academic circles, right? So there's a few things to pick here. So let's go over quickly first the chariot analogy of Chandrakirti's, right? That this is Chandrakirti's one of many ways of rejecting the notion of personhood, right? There's the anatman, right? The one of the differentiating features that Nagarjuna himself had to face, let alone his students, such as Chandra, and later on in the Tibetan spaces. This notion of personhood is somehow a very subtle form of self-grasping ignorance that is a cause of rebirth as well, right? So then the notion becomes, then Chandrakirti kind of employs this meteorological analysis of the chariot, and he's saying, okay, if we take the horse away, does it still count as the chariot designatively speaking? If you take away the wheels, does it still count as a chariot, and so on and so forth? So he's trying to say that the self is not the sum of the aggregates nor the sum of its parts. He's kind of rejecting this Gestaltian approaches to a sense of the self also, right? So he's trying to push forth this idea not only of the selflessness of persons, which is a significant realization to progress on the Mahayana path, but he's also trying to kind of encourage his debaters, his instigators, whomever else is interacting with, including other Madhyamikas, right? He's trying to be extraordinarily convincing that if you look for a self, you will never be able to find one. However, I think that an unintended consequences in Chandrakirti's prasangika move here is that you can literally apply this kind of mereological analysis to anything, right? If I take away the first noble truth, does it still count as the Buddha's teachings? If you take away the second noble truth, does it still count as the Buddha's teachings? I think that this notion of parts, wholes, and the sum of its parts, and what actually counts as a total framework of analyzing a sensorial and experiential schema can get very problematic quite easily, right? Let's take, for example, this is the Guhya Samaja Mandala. The reason why I've chosen this one specifically is because these debates are still live, right? I mean, Bob Thurman's students at Columbia are currently translating in the second volume Chandrakirti's commentary on the Guhya Samaja Mandala, right? So there's several deities. I mean, the 32 according to the Gyume and Gyuto system. Some although the Sanskrits don't necessarily point to exactly 32, and some people can even say there's 33, 35, and so forth. But needlessly, let's just say that this is one of the respective deities of the Sangha practice, right? So his name is Vijnata, right? So if you remove Vijnata out of the Guhya Samaja Mandala, is it still the Guhya Samaja practice? Or are we left with something else, or are we left with nothing at all, right? So it seems that Chandrakirti really needs to cross-apply the same critiques that he has towards personhood, towards the very foundational doctrines of the Buddha. And to some extent he does, right? And that's where things get interesting, because Chandrakirti eventually says, well, not even the Buddha withstands ultimate analysis, right? And then Chandrakirti students themselves can go as far as saying, well, not even Chandrakirti himself withstands ultimate analysis. So then what happens then, right? So this kind of compositional nihilism can be extraordinarily challenging, especially if people always have to subscribe to these kinds of notions. Now, yeah, that's been about 15 minutes, tentative references, and yeah, thank you. I'll take questions for the next few minutes or so if you guys would like to have a discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew, for a very thought-provoking presentation. For the main reason that you are able to show the dialectic logic both in Hegel as well as in Madhyamaka school. And your comparison is something very remarkable, and we are very grateful to you for a very nice presentation. Now this paper is open for discussion. If somebody wants to raise question, please raise your hand. Yeah, Grant, Mr. Grant. Please go on.
Hey, Andrew.
Hey.
Hey, good evening to you, or good early morning.
Yeah.
No, I don't, it's not necessarily a comment or critique on what you said. I'm just curious if you have compared the concept of thesis, antithesis with Darwin to get a biological perspective on it.
Are we talking here? Good. So there's actually this Professor Sebastian Gardner. He's trying to say, well, you can have naturalist interpretations of Hegel. We'll take them piece by piece, right? So let's go to the Hegelian side first. So Sebastian Gardner would try to convince you that Hegel is pre-Darwin, right? So anything that Hegel understood as change over time, right? Be it biological or metaphysical or historical or philosophical or whatever else, any type of change, any type of from T1 to T2, there's something different, right? Gardner would try to persuade you to say, hey, well, this is the best that Hegel could have done prior to the expose of natural selection, and you can find them as totally compatible. Do I agree with?
Oh, hold on. No, not on natural selection. It's a very, very simple concept from Darwin, where just to give you a really basic example, say a dog is having a positive experience, the tail goes up, versus a negative experience, the tail goes down, and it's involuntary biological reactions to an external response that seem to have no real value. And that's kind of what Darwin was getting at, was, what is the point of some of these oppositions in physical response to opposite external reactions, when really there doesn't seem to be any value in it. But even just from a standpoint of synthesis, then what then happens if there's no physical response to this? Does that go into that negation of a negation sort of concept you were talking about? So it's a really simple idea that I was asking about, but it's really very much about involuntary physical response that he was using that same terminology for, but it not about change over time and natural selection.
I'm not really sure what Hegel would have to say about stimulus responses or involuntary
I'm curious
acts.
what you have to say about it.
Oh, I mean, I'm a total determinist. I'm a hardline
Yeah.
determinist. I think that all stimulus responses are predetermined by endless Markovian causal chains or whatever. Like there's, I don't think that there's such a thing as free will. If you're asking myself personally, presentation aside, yeah, my response would be that even the appearance of free will is not actually a free choice, but just a bunch of very witty neural responses that gives you the inferential impression that you have a free choice. But I don't think you have such a thing. I don't think any of us ever had. This presentation has been decided by the mechanisms of the universe since time immemorial. I mean, biologists talk about us winning the genetic lottery all the time, right? Out of all the possible bajillions to the 10th power of genetic permutations, to be a human alive today is the odds are very slow, right? I mean, we all today as humans have won our respective genetic lotteries to be here. So if that is due to randomness or due to a sense of causal predeterminacy, well, that's up for debate, but I would side with the determinist here.
No, but in the, I guess in the concept more of the synthesis portion of it, where if you cease to have any reaction, so say if what you're saying, this is all predetermined, well, what if you can physically step outside of that, that if you are not responding to that anymore, is that similar to the concepts of nirvana? You know, or
Okay, sure. So whether or
Yeah.
not there's movement in nirvana is a question that I don't think has a right answer. Because you'll find Buddhists on every possible side, right? You'll find Buddhists that say that because of cessation, all movement happens in space and time. So if cessation, right, that's kind of why so many Vedanta, proto-Vedantists at the time were calling Nagarjuna an annihilationist or a nihilist, right? Because they were saying, well, if there's no more movement, and if cessation means total cessation of movement, well, what does that actually mean for the mind, right? Yeah, that's definitely an interesting question. What would they say? Well, if all appearances cease and all, right? I mean, it depends on whose view you're with here, as far as what really is the mind of the Buddha and whether or not it has movement. Does movement only involve some sort of behavioral, like I raise my arm kind of thing, or is there obviously all Mahayanists would agree that conceptual cessation happens, that conceptual cessation is necessary to progress on the path. But then there's also people that say that you won't stop thinking either. Well, what does that mean? Or that your entire, some people say that it's a misinterpretation to say that all movement ceases, but it's more like all there's perhaps no more distinction of voluntary and involuntary movement kind of thing. I mean, if you're omnipresent, then you're one with everything and one with the great whatever, right? I mean, it's like you don't know what it's like to be a leaf falling off of a tree or whatever. You're an entity perceiving reality through the point of view of a subject, right? And the Mahayanists are very keen on saying, well, there's ultimately no subject-object distinction. So I don't know if that means that whether or not the nirvanic omnibenevolent mind of the Buddha knows what it's like when a leaf falls in on the streets.
Well, I mean, but you're kind of saying that we are leaves falling from a tree, that we aren't that we're just sort of following a pre-written script. So I'm more getting at if we are experiencing just a passive experience, the leaf falling from the tree, if it just suspended itself, more of that sort of idea, because you're using this analogy of a leaf falling from the tree and saying that we don't experience that, but at the same time you're saying that everything's predetermined. So
yeah, I mean, we don't experience this now, but I mean, the Buddhists would have two responses at least here, right? They would at least say, well, there's like Grant now, the appearance of Grant as the autonomous sentient being, right? Totally operating in this conventional world, irrespective of whether or not there's a causal relationship to a leaf falling off the tree, right? Like your sort of sensorial experience of the world is not causally affected in any meaningful way in the status quo by the falling of a leaf, right? But this is pre-Buddhahood Grant. Let's say in 5 aeons when you become the Buddha or whatever else, right? at that point there's no more Grant isolated in the human body as such, right? And your mind stream becomes all pervasive, right? Some Nigma Termas would give you the analogy of a river that flows back into the lake. At that point, there would be no more distinction between any sort of experience as such. But what are the respective sensorial implications? The texts aren't particularly specific on that. The text pays such special emphasis to notions like enlightened perception or progress on the path through conceptual cessation or non-dualistic approaches to the path that they didn't leave. I think that's, we can defer back to what Bupesh is saying about the silence of the Buddha kind of thing, right? I mean, some things perhaps are beyond our capacity to sensorially internalize, but they are explainable with more neat kind of linguistic representational schemas that we don't have access to yet, if that answers your question. Yeah. Okay, good.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you,
Thanks, Andrew.
Grant, Mr. Grant, and Mr. Andrew. Andrew, can I ask one general question?
Yeah,
With
sir.
regard to Madhyamika, because it's very fascinating to listen to you, especially when you made a beautiful comparison of Hegel with Madhyamika. I was reminded of Graham Priest. I sometime back I saw a video. You also might have seen that very beautiful video lecture given by Graham Priest on Hegel and Madhyamika Buddhism. Now, when I listened to you, I got this question, but of course it is indirectly related to your topic. Now, see, whenever we talk about Madhyamika, we always, sometimes, not always, sometimes we try to compare it with Derrida, my favorite philosopher, for the main reason that he is the one who tries to demolish this sort of bipolar concepts as well as transcending the metaphysical categories which we have been operating on. Now, keeping that at the backdrop, would you say that Madhyamika comes very close to Derridian approach of deconstruction?
I'm not very familiar with Derrida, but I would still like to say a few things here. I would defer to you to Rakesh sir again, who is in the audience but doesn't even want to say hello to us. Rakesh sir has this brilliant move of saying, why do we need Derrida when we have Russell? Anything that Derrida can say and do, Russell can say simpler, faster, and more efficiently. And I would obviously defer you to Rakesh sir, because he has quite a brilliant analysis of deconstructing Derrida's work itself. Now, if we're talking about kind of this notion of conceptual deconstruction in the context, and I mean, I've heard some arguments going along the lines of what the Madhyamikas are pointing to is some sort of semantic beginninglessness, right? That because all kind of concepts and their representations are in some sort of interdependence relation, this interdependence relation doesn't have a respective causal origin. And that kind of also goes nicely with the Buddhist story that we are here in samsara because we are not free from that beginningless ignorance as such. And once we awaken, then we can release ourselves from the bounds of attachments and whatever else. That sounds neat as long as you stop there. But the Buddhists become very clear about I don't know. This is where maybe I'm injecting too much Bhartrhari into Buddhism. Maybe this is my mistake. I'm a huge fan of Patanjali, maybe not, but Bhartrhari I do find very close here, because he would say that Om is the supreme bija mantra. All possible syllables stem from Om. I think this is a very unique feature of Sanskrit, the Sanskrit grammatical system that is not necessarily resemblant to anything Western as such. So that's why I hesitate to go too far with the Western linguistic schemas here, because the least reducible syntactical component in Western philosophy of language, atomically speaking, going through Russell, right? We have the word. The word itself, if you're an atomist about language, it is the foundational scope of meaning that can encapsulate some sort of information, right? But in the Sanskrit grammar, that's not necessarily the case. The letters themselves, the vowels themselves, the consonants themselves can have a very unique kind of not only phonetic feature, but also information theoretic feature as well, right? So with that in mind, that means that we don't stop at making sense and like hermeneutically we don't perceive, if you're like, if we talk about user interface and the experience of the subject into the world, the basic computational analysis to a Sanskritist is not the word, it's the bija itself, right? It's a specific kind of word, right? So that kind of deconstructs even further this notional understanding of what are these specific dependence relations as such, right? And the Buddhists themselves have very sophisticated kind of interpretations of grammar also later eventually. I mean, not Chandrakirti. Chandrakirti wasn't much of a sophisticated grammarian, but there's later people on like Ralotsawa and Marpa Lotsawa is a very famous one, right? The most people in India have heard of. There's Sakya Pandita also, and Padma Karpe. So there's a lot of kind of overlaps there as far as even how the later Himalayan Buddhist systems are adopting this notion that there is something more. There is something more primitively informative in syntax than the atomic components of words themselves, down to a specific kind of Susurian kind of meanings in specific symbols, right? So, but even with all of this being said, if Om is the primary bija mantra, right? If all appearances and all capacities to seize appearances, right? If the totality of all causes and effects can be understood through a clear and pure, right? If we go to Chandrakirti's Prasanapada, if Om is really, then if it has that sense of origin, right? I mean, to me, that clarifies a lot of things, that that time itself and the linguistic computation itself is more linear than these kind of cyclical interpretations of how we perceive reality, right? I mean, that's one answer, but the other answer would be, even if you don't buy into that, even if that's too much Bhartrhari and too much of my own personal bias into how Sanskrit grammar and Tibetan grammar work, there's stuff like, okay, the answer would be, so what? Nagarjuna himself and everybody else would just say, so what? Any conceptual grasping is a cause of self. It's a cause of self-grasping as such. Either way, the infinitive, the foundational linguistic schemas are still there. It doesn't matter if you're a nihilist about composition. It doesn't matter if you're a eternalist. It doesn't matter if you're a Vedantist. It doesn't matter if you're a Charvaka or anything, or a Jaina or whatever else. The foundational intelligibility standards of language are the same. Whether you say that it is not, it both is or is not, or you reject both sets of assertions, or a grand priestess fifth corner for whatever that means, right? Irregardless of what kind of metaphysical paradigm you hold, right? You still require some foundational aspects of grammar to work. And this is where Nagarjuna and everybody else in the Madhyamika system will tell you, well, that's already false. That's already samvriti. That's not paramati satya, right? The samvriti will always constrain you in some conceptual way, irregardless of what it is, right? The only way to truly transcend is not necessarily to trace these interdependent relations all the time or whatever else. It's emptiness itself that destroys all the shunyata vacuum, right? The capacity to overcome and transcend conceptual grasping, irregardless of what grammatical or metaphysical position you have, in such a way that you overcome these bounds of the four extremes. Insofar as you're constrained by the Chatushkoti, it doesn't matter what grammatical position you have. That's what Sakya Pandita would say also. I think all Mahayanas, I mean, there's disagreements about, well, what does that mean and how do we escape the four extremes and what's the fastest way to escape the four extremes? But as far as I'm concerned, all Buddhists would say, no, all conceptual proliferation has to cease. That's why there's such a special emphasis on the Prapanch also. That the reason why I mentioned the Dashabhumi Sutra, I mean, it has a lot of things to say about perception and the Arya perception, and Hegel also doing his own spiel with the perceptions. But the more critical, arguably the more critical component here is conceptual cessation, right? What's the causal dependence relation here is also up for debate. But the only way you can move from the seventh ground to the eighth ground after, right? There's two main steps in the Dashabhumi Sutra. From the seventh bhumi to the eighth bhumi, there's the realization of the selflessness of personhood, that anatman emphasis, that notion that there's neither you nor me nor etc. But the advancements, which is kind of what goes in, what Grant was asking for also, is the selflessness of phenomena, right? That's the more subtle realization in the Madhyamaka system. It's that it's important to celebrate the realization of the selflessness of persons, but the more subtle realization that completes the path as such, from the eighth bhumi to the 10th bhumi into nirvana. It's this apprehension of and realization of the selflessness of phenomena, and that's even the Madhyamikas themselves would tell you that that's that's a heftier but more interesting task to have on your desk also. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Andrew, for a very nice presentation. We are all grateful to you. And now Megha has a question, I think. Please. Megha?
Yeah, it was only. When you said F and not F at the same time, you referred it to.
You are not audible.
No, go ahead.
So when you refer to F and not F at the same time, you referred it to Becoming by Hegel, right? I just want to not hear me.
Not audible. Adjust your mic, please.
Can you hear me now?
No.
You can try to log out and try to log back in.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, good.
Fine.
Okay, so I'll keep my video off then. So when you said about F and not F at the same time, you referred it to becoming. That is by, I just wanted to ask, is it your reference to the notion of becoming, or is it something that Hegel has talked about? Okay, and the second thing is that, when Madhyamaka refers to becoming, just understanding it through a Buddhist perspective, I would say that it refers to it through a non-fixation of identity. It says that nothing has a fixed identity. That's why everything is going in becoming. But when you refer to the concept of becoming to Hegel, I wanted to ask that when F is F and when F is not F, when the becoming has ended, perhaps does it have a fixed identity there? And like, is it designated to move in each other, like F becoming not F? Always, like, does Hegel says anything about that? Does, like, Madhyamaka, the causes and the conditions that impact the identity, does for Hegel it goes the same?
I would ask you a clarificatory question though.
Yeah.
What do you mean by identity here? Are we talking about generic identity, T1, T2, or are we talking about some qualitative identity as designation? Right. Even the Dhyamikas would make a distinction here.
Yeah, I would say the quality, like
Okay.
the causes and the conditions always changes things in the sense that it changes its qualities. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so we can start with both Hegel and the Madhyamikas accept impermanence. Whether or not it's the same interpretation of impermanence, well, that can be that's up for grabs, because you would also have to defer to the practical aspects and bring in the political aspects of both the Madhyamikas and the Hegelians, and obviously they conceive of that quite differently because of their respective socio historical divergences. Now, as per what does it mean for Hegel? So okay, yes, I'm the one that made the note of the negation of negation being the same as the links of becoming bhava. That is part of the argument of why I think they're loosely similar, because I think they're mentioning becoming in the same way. So there's a passage that I actually did not include in the presentation because, again, I wanted to have more of a discussion. So this is Hegel. This is not the Madhyamaka system. So Hegel would say here, this is posited, but it is rather an other that is posited, or that this is superseded, and this otherness, or the setting aside of the first, is in turn set aside and has to be returned into the first. All right. So it's he's kind of then later on talking about, well, this is the present moment, and the present moment is always an infinitive in the present simple, right? And then whenever you look at the past was always the present when it was occurring as such, right? So a few things on that. So if you want to stretch it to Marx and say this is some sort of temporal alienation that only makes sense to the experiential sensorial schema of an entity, if and only if they can, perfectly somehow recognize the past as in the present or whatever else, that's outside of the scope of what I'm trying to argue. But as far as what the Buddhists would say, well, there's different theories of time and dharma, right? I mean, there's the Kshanikavada doctrine of the Gnaga and Dharmakirti and the Pramanavartaka also, and there's eventually later on tantric developments, and then there's a whole array of debates in the Upper Himalayas about what time is and who gets what and for what reason, and it has very visible practical consequences, which again, that leads into the more the political side of the Madhyamakas. But as far as theoretical constructions are concerned, because you're concerned more of the qualitative aspect, right? You're saying that the bhava occurs, right? Like the chain of the effect link of the bhava only happens in the temporal instances in which there's some sort of grasping at a qualitative identity, right? If I understood what you're saying. Good. They would agree to that. They would definitely agree to that. The any type of identity that grasps at a self is a cause of rebirth. Sure. The Madhyamikas would accept that. Now it's a question of, well, why does that matter? Why does it not? Here's an important distinction, though, that I didn't have the chance to address. After the 8th Bhumi, the Bodhisattvas can still experience rebirth as such, right? Well, that makes no sense, because if they already have access to a samadhi and they've already had some like paramita samadhi kind of sensorial access, right? They don't experience time as such, right? I mean, a lot of Vajrayana texts would tell you that there's an atemporality to the experience of samadhi, right? In whichever samadhi state you are. So then the notion is like, okay, well, so what? The text would tell you then that the practitioner can get out of that state of atemporal samadhi and voluntarily take rebirth into samsara. Again, I don't think it's voluntary, because everything is predetermined, and I think that's part of the mistake, the conceptual mistakes that even the higher level bodhisattvas make. But that's kind of my beef with the Madhyamaka system, not necessarily for this presentation. But the bodhisattvas then would say, well, they don't produce karma, right? They don't. No, the Gorampa would tell you that there's no contaminated karma, that a sentient being is only subjected to the causes and conditions of rebirth if and only if there's some aspect of self-grasping ignorance, which in turn produces some type of contaminated karma. And then Gorampa and company would eventually say, well, technically a bodhisattva after the 8th ground does not produce contaminated karma. Like the bodhisattva is appearing in the world, or the Buddha is appearing in the world as such, but they don't leave any kind of residual traces of contaminated karma, right? So then there's the question of, well, does that mean that they have any activities? Well, yeah, because there's a lot of kriya in the bodhisattva, right? There's so many, there's hordes of examples of bodhisattvas doing all sorts of stuff, right? In respective cosmic realms or on this planet or whatever else. So obviously they have access to some kriya, to some movement in some way, and that influences and liberates and removes the ignorance of other sentient beings. But at the same time, though, it comes into question of, well, do they cognize this kind of qualitative grasping that you're talking about, right? Because if they can be in and out of samadhi and whatever else, well, what the heck does this mean for qualities, right? And what the heck are qualities then? And why does it matter if we ditch everything, right? If we ditch concepts, if we ditch perception, if we ditch qualities, well, what's left? Weren't the Vedantists right all along to just say that Nagarjuna was some annihilationist in disguise, and we can just wrap it up that way? Not really. I don't think it's as simple as that, right? Because the Madhyamikas are extraordinarily witty about how they run their perceptual and conceptual schemas of appearances, right? So there's Madhyamikas that would go as far as saying, well, technically what we saw of the Buddha, that was not the real Buddha, right? That was Siddhartha Gautama, the prince, the Arhat foe destroyer, etc. But that's not the nature of the Buddha itself, right? That's not the actual nirvanic manifestation of the Buddha. But because of our deluded perceptions, because of our incorrect apprehensions of reality, we perceive a physical body just like ours, in a dreamlike world, in a dreamlike state that, speaks human words and knows Pali and knows how to sit down and meditate under a tree and is hungry and is thirsty and is subject to disease and whatever else. But a lot of people say, well, that's just some appearance of the glorious, luminous mind of the Buddha to make sense to us mortals that have no idea what's happening in the real reality. And the purpose of that body of the Buddha was to remove that kind of ignorance through the respective teachings at the time. Is that persuasive to me? No, but that's the answer that a Madhyamaka would give you, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
just now I got a note from Prasanna to conclude the session because already we are late.
Okay.
And this session was a very stimulating and very thought-provoking session. And I am grateful to all the paper presenters for their excellent presentation. And my special thanks are due to Mr. Andrew for giving a new approach to both Hegel and Madhyamika. In fact, I am very much benefited by your paper. And I also, all the paper presenters, they have given a new dimension to the problem. And we thank all of them. And also we thank Professor Shikala for arranging this wonderful meeting. And I also thank Prasanna Kumar, who is arranging this program. Thank you. Thank you very much.